Welcome, sport fans. So I'm Coach Kathy Kemper, founder and CEO of the Institute for Education. And our mission is to harness the power of data, innovation, and soft diplomacy in the global community. And we've been doing this for over 30 years. Today, we welcome Virginia Senator Mark Warner. Welcome, Senator Warner, and thank you for joining us with our IFE online virtual program. And now I'm going to hand this off to the one, the only, compounded awesome, former United States Chief Technology Officer, rock star, founder of the Civic Tech Revolution, Todd Park, and IFE Innovation Steward, Amy Ging, IFE's very own power couple. So Todd, take it away.
Thanks so much, Coach. I'm delighted to be here as Amy's inferior half. I will be channeling the spirit of Coach to kick things off. Senator Warner, it's fantastic to see you. And it's such an incredible honor to have you as our special guest today. As you were chatting about with Coach, you've been working with IFE for over 20 years, which I know she appreciates so very much. And I'll always remember when our mutual great friend Anish Chopra first introduced us. Yep. You blew me away. And after walking out of your office, I turned to Anish and said, I am so massively, unbelievably grateful as an American to have Senator Warner in the United States Senate. Thank you so much, Senator Warner, for everything you've done, all that you continue to do to unleash innovation and awesomeness in government and in the country. You are a truly phenomenal force for American good. Before we start, Kaivan Shroff, IFE Senior Fellow, will load us up with all the requisite social media hashtags and handles. Kaivan, are you on?
Yes, I am. I'll be pasting those right in the chat. Please join us online to continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Kaivan. And before we get started, a series of warm welcomes. Welcome to IFE Artificial Intelligence Diplomatic Steward and European Union Ambassador, Stavros Lambrinidis. Welcome to ambassadors from Singapore, Estonia, Ireland, Luxembourg, Albania, Bosnia, the Bahamas, and Bulgaria. It seems like Senator Warner has an international fan club that's very illustrious. And a huge shout out, of course, to Megan Smith, Anish Chopra, Matt Lira, John Paul Farmer, and Dr. R. David Edelman, all IFE supporters, former speakers, and amazing leaders. I saw so awesome to see the power couple of Tim O'Reilly, Civic Tech Jedi Master, and Jen Palka, legendary founder of Code for America and co-founder of the U.S. Digital Service, here with us. It's wonderful to see the awesome Josh DeFrancis, director of the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program here, along with other sisters and brothers in the PIF community. Welcome to the Presidential Innovation Fellows, USDS, Tech Congress, TTS, and Coding It Forward superheroes joining us this morning. There are several new Presidential Innovation Fellows and Tech Congress Fellows in the audience. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much with all of our hearts for signing up to serve our country. We welcome you into our big and growing Civic Tech family. We love you, and we'll all be here for you as you embark upon your amazing public service journeys. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my former White House teammate, Suhas Subramanyam, who coordinated this event with Senator Warner on behalf of IFE. Suhas serves as a proud member of the Virginia House of Delegates, representing the 87th District. He's focused passionately on improving technology, transportation, infrastructure, and general awesomeness in the US, working both in the private and public sectors. In the very highest compliment I can pay him, he is a young Senator Warner in the making. Suhas, take it away.
Thank you so much, Todd. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Coach, and for all the people who joined this call today. This is, I think, the maybe second or third time I've introduced Senator Warner, and it's I always have something different to talk about because he's done so many amazing things in his career as governor, as a U.S. Senator. But before I introduce him, I'm going to take speaker's privilege to just mention kind of one thing that's going on right now in our government, which is we have this transition going on from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And I was a part of Team CTO under Megan and Todd, and Anish is here too. And you know, the reason a lot of our work was able to continue and transition to the Trump White House was because of the work that a lot of people on in both administrations did. I thought of all the processes I saw in the transition, the tech transition was one of the most, I think, fluid and one of the most peaceful. And I thought that a lot of the work done by this group, I see Corey Zarek here as well, a lot of the work she did helped us continue this work. And another reason a lot of the work has continued from the beginning of OSTP and PIF and all these amazing USDS, all these amazing programs that Todd, Anish, and Megan and others have continued is because right before the Obama administration ended, there was actually legislation passed to make the PIP program enshrined in law. And that legislation was introduced and passed in a bipartisan way by Senator Warner. He was a huge part. He's always been a huge ally to all of the work that many of us who are on this call have championed and made our life's work. And so, one of the things I've learned serving in all facets of government and all branches of government is you need people in the legislative branch, you need people all over the executive branch to really get something done. And Senator Warner has always been that champion to the work that we have done on the Capitol Hill. And so I thank him. And I thank him also for the work he's done on modernizing, not only here in Virginia, all that we've done, but just all over the country, modernizing our government and continuing to back us whenever we needed something done. So without further ado, I'm very proud to introduce Senator Mark Warner.
Well, Suhas, thank you. And thank you for your great leadership, both not only on the technology side, but obviously as a really remarkable rising star in Virginia. And Coach, it's always everything that you touch, everything that Coach Kemper touches over many years, always comes out extraordinarily successful. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to do this again. And a big shout out to Todd and Megan and Anish, and I'm seeing Tim. I see a whole bunch of folks who have been in these battles for a long, long time. And I didn't realize it was going to be this exalted a group, actually. So I may kind of change my pitch midstream here, but I really appreciate this opportunity and congratulate all of you. And as I was getting on, hearing some of the kudos from Matt in terms of keeping these efforts moving forward during the Trump administration. And I think there's going to be a chance to renew and refresh a number of the activities in the Biden administration. I'm really, Suhas mentioned when we made sure that the Presidential Innovation Fellows kind of got put into law, and that was the Talent Act back in 2017. There are times when we, even in spite of ourselves, we actually get stuff done up here in Congress. And I've been, over the last month, been up to my, whatever body part you want to imagine, on both, first of all, trying to negotiate this COVID package. It was really an attempt by a bipartisan group of senators who got so freaking frustrated by the failure of the so-called leadership to even freaking talk to each other as we are watching our country and the economy, slide back into a bit of an abyss. And this whole idea that, we're going to have people lose unemployment the day after Christmas. We're going to have people get kicked out of their apartments the day after New Year's, that we've seen these food banks get hit at unprecedented numbers. And I'm really, really proud of the fact that this bipartisan group that started with 8 of us, who at about 15, 16, we put together the framework of what, God willing, the House and Senate will pass today and put $900 billion of relief into our economy and to our ambassadorial friends. This was kind of the ultimate sausage making in terms of American lawmaking. And there's some, great side stories of how this came about, which we can get to during the question period. But the good news, and I think the best news about it, is that the number of senators, again, in both parties who come up to me and said, "Oh, Mark, next time you do one of these, put me in the club, put me in the group." There is, I think, a real sense from a whole lot of members in both political parties that the failure to legislate, the failure to act, the kind of constant partisan bickering is not something that can continue or should continue. So, I actually go into the holidays, which was an otherwise pretty crappy 2020. For our non-Americans, crappy is a technical term that we sometimes use. I actually am more optimistic than I think conventional wisdom would postulate. I also was asked, I will do a mini version because people like Anish have heard this story a gazillion times. I was asked by Coach and others to give a little bit of background as how I got into the kind of tech field. I am not by any means technically trained. I'm actually first person in my family to graduate from college. I went to GW here in DC, undergrad, then went to Harvard for law school, quickly determined I did not want to be a lawyer and bill in 6-minute increments, had a real interest in politics, worked on Capitol Hill while I was in college, and then worked in politics right after law school. But very quickly determined I didn't want to stay in politics as a, kind of, I might want to try something in politics on my own at some point. So I decided I wanted to be rich enough to lose, and I didn't have any money, so I decided to become an entrepreneur. I went out, took my life savings, about $5,000, invested in a little energy startup company, went to work for that company. 6 weeks later, I helped the company go totally bankrupt. I then went into real estate and failed at that in 6 months. So at the age of about 26, I was living out of my car, sleeping on my friends' couches, who'd all, many of them law school classmates who were all working at these big fancy firms, and got a third opportunity. And let me acknowledge on the front end, if I had not been a white guy with the appropriate education, I'm not sure I would have got a third shot or a second shot or maybe in a first shot, but my third shot, I was really fortunate to fall into the very beginnings of the cellular telephone industry back in 1982 as the American government was giving out that spectrum. And I do like to remind all of my law school friends that I went to almost all of them and said, there's this new technology coming along, cell phones, you ought to invest. And every one of them to a person said, oh, Warner, you are so stupid. Go get a real job. Who's going to want a cell phone? They are still billing in 6-minute increments. And I started a company called Nextel and then a venture capital fund. And, through osmosis as much as anything else, kind of got a sense of how technology was and continues to change our world. I ran, decided to get back involved in politics, ran for the US Senate, actually against a guy named John Warner back in the mid-90s and lost. Although since we both had the same last names, Warner, the only kind of creative thing that came out of that campaign, Mark Warner versus John Warner, we had a bumper strip that said Mark, not John on it. And for those of you who are non-Virginians, the southern tier of Virginia is pretty rural and conservative. And more often than not, when people saw that bumper strip, they asked whether it was a biblical reference rather than a political statement. But there was no divine intervention. John Warner won, although I quickly add, he and I became dear friends after that, and he's endorsed me for my last two Senate races. I then went on, ran for governor, and was very, very proud of the fact as governor, we consolidated very much of our technology operations. We're kind of on the bleeding edge of how you take IT at a state level and think about it in a different way. And many of the kind of conceptual ideas were things that were taken much further by the Obama administration's efforts, and so many of the efforts again that Coach Kemper and all of you are involved in. Governor in Virginia, you can only get 1 4-year time. You can't run sequentially, but had a great run as governor. Really enjoyed the job. Came here to the Senate in 2000, got elected in 2008. In the midst of the financial crisis, same time Obama was elected. I'll get to the questions quickly, but I got pretty frustrated the first number of years in the Senate. The Senate is still a place where no matter what you've done beforehand, you're basically told go to the end of the line and wait your turn. And it has been a somewhat frustrating experience. Although the last few years, maybe because I've waited my turn, maybe because I've gotten a position as the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee that has raised a host of issues, maybe because I've been able to kind of think through some of these issues related to technology, I'm a much happier camper. And two of those things that I want to just touch on very briefly before we start the conversation. One, now starting about 5 years ago, really started looking at this question of the future of work. and started an initiative at the Aspen Institute, and it's really grown into 3 categories, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. One, to recognize we really need to change the social contract. I think the American social contract is broken because we, in the 20th century, existed in an economy where people went to work for the same firm their whole life, their whole career, and all of the benefits and social insurance structure was tied to that long-term employment, whether it was healthcare, whether it was retirement, whether it was, the only people who got any kind of workman's comp or unemployment or disability were people who were long-term W-2 employees. That world has dramatically changed by gig work, by people moving from job to job, career to career. I think we need to reimagine a social safety net. And I think there's a lot we can learn from our European and Asian friends who are much further along on this, about how we create a portable benefit system, how we think about with the first hour of work, no matter what kind of work, rather than focusing on worker classification, how do we make sure that there are benefits and those benefits attached to you and are portable? Secondly, how do we really rethink the whole concept of investment in human capital? I like to point out in America, we have a tax, accounting, and reporting system that always incents innovation on tangible goods rather than innovation in human capital. I like to point out, a company buys a robot, that robot will get an R&D tax credit. The robot can be an asset on your balance sheet. If you're a public company, you can report it. A company invests the same amount of money and actually trains 2 human beings to be more efficient than the robot. You don't get the same tax treatment. It's viewed as an expense. There's no actually reporting mechanism. So I think a big idea that I hope that we will get a chance to push forward is this idea of changing the incentive structure around investment in human capital. And finally, this has kind of morphed into a broader discussion that's kind of come out of the shadows a little bit, really around the notion of, what kind of capitalism is going to really work in the 21st century. I have been clearly a beneficiary of American capitalism. Again, I think appreciating the fact that as a white guy, I probably had more opportunities than most, but I think the kind of short-term profit-driven only shareholder capitalism that's dominated the last 20 years is ultimately self-destructive. And I do think we need to move to a more of a stakeholder capitalism model that includes, being successful for your shareholders, being successful for your employees, for your community. And I think there's, again, a broad area of potentially bipartisan consensus around that. So one thing that has taken a lot of my time, and hopefully going forward will take more, are these whole questions around future work. The other, and one that I wanted to obviously raise with this community, is the questions around technology. I think for a long time, like many, we were maybe too techno-optimistic. We saw only good things, innovations coming around from technology. Sitting from my position on the Intel committee and kind of really digging in to what the Russians did in terms of their attempt to manipulate our elections in 2016, and candidly catching the American intelligence community and our tech platforms with the manipulation of Facebook and YouTube and other platforms really off guard. There's great things that come with technology, but there's also with any innovation, there's an upside and there's a dark underbelly. And I think we're still grappling with the questions about how we put some framework and don't come in as pure tech optimists, but also realize there are going to be these sometimes underbellies that we have to grapple with. Have got a lot of ideas on that, a lot of legislative ideas, a lot of notions, I think, that are generally bipartisan, that can move that debate forward. And again, we see it, we've seen it most recently with the SolarWinds hack. This is more beyond kind of the more moral questions raised around social media platforms, but just the kind of national security concerns. I candidly think in this country, we spend way too much money on planes, ships, tanks, and guns. And that is a heresy in a state like Virginia that is so defense oriented, when so much of the competition in the 21st century, and as well as national security, will be around cyber, will be around space, will be around, who's going to set the standards, not only on 5G and artificial intelligence and quantum computing, but a host of new technology innovation areas where, quite honestly, this country is not keeping up and has not built the broad-based, values-based multilateral approach that I think we were historically the beneficiaries of. I'm going to move to the questions period now, but I really want to thank all of you, particularly you, the Presidential Innovation Fellows. I mean, we really need you, your engagement, your involvement, now more than ever. You know, there are so many issues at so many levels that we are, as a country, confronting. Obviously, many of these divides have been accelerated by COVID. In many ways, COVID has simply accelerated, I would argue, the move to a digital economy, you know, by probably a decade. And we see that in things like telehealth. And on the upside, we also see it in the lack of broadband on the downside. And your innovative ideas, you know, just plain smarts, we really desperately need. And obviously with people like Todd and Megan and Anish and others, Tim, and there's a whole host of folks on this call who have been absolute leaders in this field for a decade. And I'm proud to call them friends and proud to be, at least from a office holder standpoint, you know, in the mix and an ally. So with that, and as usual, as any senator, I'm supposed to do that for 8 or 9 minutes. I think I went 12, but you know, a 4-minute override as a senator is actually a fairly limited amount. So why don't I throw it back to, I don't know if I'm back to Suhas or Amy or who's up next, and we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Senator Warner, for that illuminating talk and your thoughtful reflections. And while we wait for questions to come in, we have some questions that have been submitted in advance. One from Ambassador Ashok Mapuri of Singapore, who is very sorry to miss this today, but he's visiting his first grandchild in Singapore right now. He asks, Senator, we have benefited tremendously from technology and innovation, but are now becoming more and more aware of the negative externalities, including in individual privacy and in ethics. Should we leave it to the tech industry to regulate itself, or is there a need for government? How can this be done to protect the individual, but not squelch innovation and entrepreneurship?
Well, congratulations to the ambassador, and I think you've asked a question that I got a lot of ideas about, and I will try to limit them. I think it is at the end of the day, frankly, unfair and not right, and never going to work to ask tech to self-regulate. Particularly when we think about, at least when we think about the social media platforms, when inherently self-regulation is going to go against their business model. I remember when we had Sheryl Sandberg come in to testify, and I, asked her whether wasn't it morally wrong that the Myanmar government was using Facebook groups to encourage violence against the Rohingya. She acknowledged it was morally wrong, but when your business model is how many eyeballs I can keep attached to your platform as long as possible, self-regulation isn't going to work, number one. And number two, I think the platforms, and I will say this to kind of not just signal out Facebook or YouTube, but I think all of them have taken advantage of the dysfunction of the United States Congress, to kind of glide without any regulation. I think at the end of the day, they will rue that, because America has given up its leadership, whether it's on privacy, and obviously California's moved, but we trail our European friends with GDPR. Other countries don't have Section 230 restraints, but we see the Christchurch Church, we see the Paris Accords, where countries are starting to grapple with content regulation. I think that we are by America not setting kind of standards that reflect our values, we could end up seeing kind of the unwinding of the global internet, which I think would be both bad for America and bad net for innovation. And we see that through data localization efforts. I'm the chair of the U.S.-India caucus. I see India and a whole host of other countries, many European countries, go on data localization. So I do think we need a regulatory framework. Let me very briefly, again, focusing mostly on social media rather than telecoms and AI or other sets of innovation that also need. Let me do this very briefly. First, I think we need privacy regulations, and I think the framework on privacy has been set. I think the only thing that is holding up privacy regulations at this point in America is, frankly, a relatively minor argument about who has the right to sue. That litigation question ought to be resolved. It's not been resolved. I think that's a huge mistake. Whether there's a private right of action or simply leave it to the individual states, there ought to be a rational compromise, but we desperately need privacy regulations. Second, where I have been is I've not yet been fully into the break them up camp in terms of the platforms. I've been what I would call in the more pro-competition camp, but I am, if we can't pass legislation, I think the move towards breakup is only going to accelerate. My buckets around the pro-competition area would be very briefly as follows. I think we ought to go ahead and ban what's called dark patterns, the manipulation of giving up information unknowingly, as consumers oftentimes do, and I think there is a way to put bipartisan legislation on prohibiting dark patterns. I think we need to press the social media companies on data valuation. The idea, there's nothing morally wrong with me giving up my personal data to have Facebook and Google, monetize that. But as a consumer, I ought to know what my data is worth, and it's complete BS when those companies say they can't give you that kind of valuation. At least you'd have a more informed consumer. Third area, I think we need data portability. At least Facebook has moved on this data portability along with interoperability, so that we can actually see the ability to, if you get tired of how you're treated on one platform, go to a new co, still be able to talk to your friends, and you might be able to inject more competition in that. And I got a few other ideas I won't go into around the pro-competition end. I also do think we need some rules of the road around Section 230. Back in the late 90s, when these were startups, trying to think of these as dumb pipes maybe made some sense. In 2020 and 21, when 65% of Americans get some or all their news from Facebook and Google, these are not dumb pipes. And we've already seen, some movement on 230 reform, whether it's sex trafficking, child pornography, bomb making. I'm working with AZ Hirono and a bunch of civil rights groups on some Section 230 reform that would not be full elimination. And I might maintain Section 230 for startup platforms, but not for some of these behemoths. And the things we're looking at are things like, obviously no Section 230 protections for advertisement. I think we ought to have civil rights laws enforced. I think that some of the personal harassment cases, and the Grindr case in particular, and platforms guarding, using Section 230 as a shield, I think is wrong. I think the ability to have injunctive relief, and again, we could get deeper in that bucket, but I do think there ought to be a Section 230 debate. And then finally, and this is the thing that I think is maybe the most important on a broader base view, and that is, I would argue that almost post-Sputnik, every major technological innovation post-Sputnik, and this is a bit of an overstatement, whether it was invented in America or not, America, by its size and heft and amount of innovation that was taking place, usually set the rules, procedures, protocols, and standards. Our technical people on the international governing boards would set those rules of the road. And it was kind of a nerdy thing, but we, America in particular, and the West writ large, enormously benefited from that. We set the rules around the internet. We set the rules around satellites. We set most of the telecom rules of the road. I think from both corporates backing off, American government backing off, somewhat I would argue, particularly in the last 4 years, the kind of America alone approach, that we are in the process of giving up that kind of leadership on standard setting. And China has swooped in, and we see already in many ways China has won the battle around 5G standards, but they are also winning the battle around AI, quantum computing, facial recognition, a whole host of other areas around standard setting. And I think there is a really important for not just America, but to re-engage on standard setting and not think about this kind of in a normal economic or military alliance, but I would call it a technology alliance, the alliance of the willing, where the Singapores and South Koreas and Taiwans and Japans and Indias and Israels and Five Eyes and NATO and others would, share technology development, but also get re-engaged in many, many ways around this standard setting process. And those standard setting processes has to include transparency, respect for human rights, a whole host of things that we kind of built in many of the other technology developments, but that we've frankly, I think moved away from, because I do think, and when I talk about China, let me be clear, my beef is with the Communist Party in China and some of their policies, not with the Chinese people. But I do think there is an alternative model that really undermines some of those values. And you look at the China 2035 document in terms of their standard setting, that is an aggressive plan that they are acting upon. So long answer, obviously got a lot of things, Amy, I'm thinking about in that space, but I'll be briefer again, I promise.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Next, we have the EU Ambassador and IFE Artificial Intelligence Diplomatic Steward. Please introduce yourself and share your question, and please mute yourself.
I did. Thanks.
Okay.
Senator, great to see you.
Nice to see
you. You mentioned a number of countries, I think very rightly, that the U.S. has to cooperate with when it comes to setting standards. The European Union, of course, and its member states are preeminent among those. So I suppose my question is, when you look at the terrain as you outlined it, what can you see a partner like the European Union do jointly with the incoming Biden administration and Congress to address indeed the China, but also the broader values and democracy challenges of tech? You implied, you said it openly, that the U.S. up to now could, but from now on perhaps should not be trying to go it alone. Do you see any priority areas in which we have to work together real fast? I sent to the group a joint communication, a recent document put out as the proposal of the EU for a new agenda with the next Biden administration on virtually every topic, including digital. Are there areas there that you see special grounds for good work together?
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, and obviously there's historically never been a closer alignment than between kind of North American values and the EU's values on things like transparency, respect for human rights. We have, I think, a lot of alignment. And my hope would be that we would think about this kind of, the term I'm using, and I think there's been a policy put forward by some folks in the UK that's even and probably more thought out, where they've actually got kind of this alliance of the willing that includes about 10 different countries. I think this idea of collaboration at the standard setting bodies, what we've seen from China recently is this, they have been willing to kind of flood the zone on the standard setting bodies. They've almost taken the best of the British and American imperialism ideas and incorporated them into their 21st century idea. So, the Belt and Road Initiative gives them a lot of votes in these standard setting bodies. I think the kind of America alone approach has rightfully pissed off our allies and friends, or even non-adversaries, not necessarily the non-aligned over the last couple of years. I think the Biden administration needs to be clear. We need to take on this challenge jointly. And I would say across a series of technology fields, I would also say, we need something from this alliance of the willing to be a response to the China 2035 standard setting document that they put out. I mean, that's an extraordinary document, extraordinary foresight. And I think we have to acknowledge, and this gets us a little bit in this country in particular into an area that is makes some of us, not me so much, but some of my Republican partners a little uncomfortable, although I think they've coming around to not only deal with non-standards, but to deal with this as technology develops and is put into the marketplace. We're going to have to look at industrial policy because what I would argue is that China has created an authoritarianism capitalism that is extraordinarily effective, where China will allow enormous domestic competition within their market, ferocious, until a national champion emerges. And I, as a telecom guy, focus on the 5G area more than most. Huawei, that national champion gets 75% of the Chinese market, that translates into 20 to 25% in one of the biggest growth markets on the global market. And then that national champion, within China, American, European, other Asian companies don't have fair competition rights, but then that Chinese national champion gets basically unlimited backing. In the case of Huawei, $100 billion. There is no American or European or Japanese or Korean company alone that can compete against that model. So we have this, collaboration that needs to start at the standard setting, then needs to think about how we have kind of democratic challengers that are going to be able to compete. And in some areas, that is going to require, I think now just speaking in America, I've got a bipartisan bill now. We'll put about $15 billion, and we've got the beginnings of it into the defense bill now, into semiconductor manufacturing here in America. There's got to be industrial policy in terms of governmental intervention. I'm looking at the same in terms of 5G and what's called open radio access network development, ORAN network, because that's again an area where Europe and the United States are better on software than on straight hardware side, where our friends in China are further ahead. But it's going to be to think about that kind of, Western, and I don't mean Western just Europe and America. I mean, I include in that Taiwan and Korea and Singapore and Japan, obviously Australia, New Zealand. We're going to have to find ways to compete with, I think, a very, very sophisticated, aggressive, and so far pretty darn successful Chinese model.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we have the Ambassador of Estonia. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm the ambassador from Estonia. Well, Stavros, my EU colleague, pretty much asked my question, so I'm gonna have to come up with a new one, which is gonna be easy. The topic is obviously hugely important. Thank you, Senator, for taking the time to talk to us, and obviously want to thank Coach and her team for bringing us together. This is truly awesome, as always. Things should turn awesome, even if they aren't before. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for having us. Senator, also, I want to reassure you the technical term crappy, the diplomatic corps uses it often as well, perfectly. And frankly, we have other terms. I'm not gonna use that. There's a huge variety. You talked about the techno optimism. I thought that was wonderful. I mean, for us in Estonia, techno optimism ended, or total techno optimism ended in 2007. We had built up a digital government, a digital society. We signed documents digitally in a legally binding way, do our taxes in 3 minutes. We even vote digitally. It all looked, happy and merry. And then in 2007, the Russians attacked us. And then we realized that, okay, the security part has to keep up. It is the way of the future. I mean, we are not going to give up anything when it comes to our digital development, but we need to make sure that the national security is up to date. So Stavros asked the question about transatlantic relations and wider international cooperation, and you talked about industrial policy, and I agree with, I think, everything you said. I think we would sign up happily. My question is more directed more towards the acute threats, not the long term, but the here and now and today, the different cyber attacks that are taking place against the United States, against Estonia, against other European and other democratic institutions. Since 2007, we in Estonia, we've tried to think through a way to not only defeat these attacks, but also deter them, so that the attacker would not consider it worthy or worthwhile to attack us again, create some kind of a deterrence posture. I'm not sure how successful we've been at that, but I am pretty convinced that whatever model we end up coming up with that actually succeeds at deterring cyber attacks would have to be transatlantic at least, or including other democratic allies at best. And I was wondering if you, as a leader in both the digital as well as the security worlds, if you could offer a few thoughts, a few ideas as to what could be done in the new Biden era between us Europeans and the Americans on this front. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Mr. Ambassador, we've followed what you have done, Estonia has done, and your other Baltic neighbors. And please don't tell us you've not been successful, because I've been pitching, we got to do what the frickin' Baltic nations have done, because I think, and what I think Sweden has done and others, where there's been an education of the population on misinformation, disinformation. That has been, with all respect to some of our friends who work with the current administration, and that's been made extraordinarily harder in this country when, in many ways, at times, Mr. Putin has not had to, plant as much the same kind of misinformation, disinformation, bots, and fake personas that took place in 2016, because it's being promoted out of American domestic sources right now. But I think there's a lot we can learn on countering misinformation, disinformation, and compare together. Number one. Number two, and the SolarWinds hack is a great example. One of the things, and I be somewhat circumspect about what I say, but one of the things about this recent hack shows that when a tier one nation state brings their top espionage or cyber talents to the table, it is very hard for any individual company, or for that matter, any non-classified part of an individual government to stop those kind of attacks. I mean, this is a level of a sophistication that has got us really reeling. And I do think one of the things, and this is an area that, again, I'd be interested in what you and Stavros and the other ambassadors thought, can we get to a level of mutual understanding where we maybe say certain things are simply traditional espionage, and while we don't like it, it's still within somewhat the rules of the game, but at some level, that espionage goes into a major attack, and there needs to be normative understandings, whether the attack is against Estonia or whether the attack is against the United States, that this kind of alliance of the willing will respond to those actions. And I don't think we've got anything near that clarity. I did one of our Sunday morning TV shows yesterday, and my good friend Mitt Romney had called this kind of like a major military attack. This is, I think, what we're playing out right now is something between a major military attack and traditional espionage on steroids. So it's somewhat in a gray area. If this was a NotPetya denial of service attack that was literally bringing down systems, I think we might have agreement there, but I'm not even sure we've got joint agreement with our European and Asian friends about what that line that's not crossed. I mean, I actually think in that category, I would be very clear that there's going to be major repercussions, and the attribution would go, even if we can't pin it to the spy services, since so many of these groups, spy service by day, cyber criminal by night, but we need to be much clearer on what the ramifications would be. And I do think, again, misinformation, disinformation, obviously the cyber challenges, and then just generally a bit of a rethinking of what national security looks like. I mean, in the United States of America, our defense budget, I think $787 billion this year. I can't remember the exact number, but there's a great statistic that it's more than the next 15 countries combined. And I'm not sure the allocation of our resources is at all right. Not only cyber, I think about, we have such a sophisticated overhead network, but boy, taking out parts of that overhead network would wreak a lot more havoc than taking out an aircraft carrier. And yet we don't think and plan it in that way. But much more in that topic area.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we have Matt Lira at the White House Office of American Innovation. Matt.
Hey, thank you, Amy. Senator, first of all, thank you for your incredible leadership on technology issues in particular and in innovation more broadly. Going back to my earlier days on the Hill as a staffer, you and your team could always be counted on to be a partner and to lead on these important issues.
Thank you, Matt.
I guess my question for today is, we often hear, like, how do we have bipartisanship in Washington? And one of the things that frustrates me about that question is that there is bipartisanship in Washington. It just doesn't get enough attention and it isn't broad enough. And so in that context, for you, Senator, how do we bring more attention to the bipartisanship that exists? And second, how do we expand it so it's more the rule rather than the exception?
Great question. And I think you're 100% right. I mean, particularly in a place where, with a divided government, you got to have bipartisanship to do anything. I think this, not to get giddy about this COVID package, but the fact that there were a batch of us that said we're tired of the finger pointing and our so-called leaders not even talking to each other. And as the economy is starting to melt down and people were not getting the assistance and businesses weren't getting the assistance they needed, and we grabbed the reins from the McConnell Pelosi battles and put out a product that is still the framework. And it was not only in the Senate, there was 50 folks in the House, problem solvers. So I think that bodes well, number one, in the number of interests in continuing, because it's going to be close no matter what happens in Georgia. Number two, I think the challenges around an emerging China. There's enormous bipartisanship. And the biggest concern I have is to make sure that when we talk about China, we don't allow, some of the rhetoric out of the administration to make this China become a proxy that, for anti-Asian, anti-Chinese American, anti-Chinese people rhetoric. My beef is with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China and the way they're treating the people of Hong Kong, the way they're treating the Uyghurs. But I think this China area is broad bipartisan. We need to not, be just reflexive and say we're going to ban Chinese students, which has been a huge source of innovation and value to this country. But I think that remains an area. And I also think on technology issues writ large, when I went through my little litany of dark patterns or the data portability or data valuation, every one of those bills are bipartisan. And even the folks who want to do the straight 230 repeal, there's some Democrats and Josh Hawley and others. So I think this technology space is really an opportunity. And I would just, it's kind of a truism. I've been saying this for 15 years, not with a lot of traction, but I think many of the issues we face, and this is obviously playing to this crowd, but I think you guys are 100% right that the issues we confront for the most part are less liberal versus conservative or left versus right and more future versus past. And the people on this call are all kind of about how do you build that more positive future. And frankly, a lot of the issues that the ignorance about technology is also broadly bipartisan where I work, especially in the Senate. And the good news is a lot of the younger Republican senators are some of the best on technology issues.
Thank you, Senator. We have so many insightful questions here today in the chat window. I'm hoping to get to a few more. Jen Palka.
That's code for Warner talked briefly on the answers. So I will do it. Go ahead.
Jen Palka and her husband both have great questions. Jen, are you unmuted? Can you unmute?
Yes, hi, sorry. Thank you. This is just fascinating. Thank you for putting it together and thank you for your time. You mentioned stakeholder capitalism, and I just wanted, I'm sorry, I didn't see Tim's question, but I maybe along the same lines. Briefly, what is the path there? How do we reform our capitalism to stop creating an overwhelming capacity? Our safety net is not holding up, despite all of the efforts by you and your peers to help deal with this COVID situation, and it wasn't earlier. So we need to reform capitalism before we drive our safety net through, drive a whole giant hole through our safety net.
Well, I agree, Jen. You and Tim have obviously been thinking about this and leaders on this for a long, long time as well. And I salute your work. I do think, and I would just immediately step back for 1 second and say, capitalism at its best has brought more people out of poverty than any other system, I would argue. But we now have a bastardized version of that capitalism that dominates in America and in many ways around the world. It was not the capitalism of post-World War II America, where so many people, even though it still had, racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, but it's still at a macro level work. So I do think this, very briefly, get past the worker classification issue and make sure there's benefits that attach with every first hour of work, and those benefits are portable that moves with you. We've already started to see, even under the Trump administration, I give credit to Jay Shelton at the SEC, a requirement for human capital reporting on public companies. I think, again, some of the movements towards long-term stock exchanges and others that move away from this constant short-termism versus long-term value creation. I think there's been work done there, but we need to do more. I think that, honestly, in a split government, even on things like climate change, having your carbon output be viewed as a materially reportable item under kind of ESG standards, I think you'd have a lot of businesses be very aggressive in moving in that space. I still think we need a carbon tax, but even short of a full regulatory framework, if we can take the ESG ideas and actually, which I still feel like there's a lot of squish in that area, and get it to be some standard and mandatorily reportable items, are some of the areas that we could I think see movement on. And frankly, I think we could see movement in a bipartisan way. There are, my friend Marco Rubio has written and talked about some of this stuff. Ben Sass and I were spending time last night on portable benefits. I think, if we simply relitigate Obamacare one more time, we're not going to get anywhere. If we can elevate this to, portable benefits or a redefinition of human capital investment so that companies are rewarded for investing in human capital, particularly low and moderate income human capital. If we can give not penalize companies who are doing long-term value investing, I think there's a great opportunity for to get out of the box.
Thank you. Tim's question specifically about the tax code and any appetite. Is there a broad appetite for deeper relook at tax preferences and incentives?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, listen, people, especially the younger people on this call, may not remember, and I'm talking about you, Todd, you're not one of those younger people. So like 40 years ago, the idea of an R&D tax credit was a radical notion that the accountants thought, like, man, research and development, it's too squishy. How do you put it as an asset class? We figured it out. And I would argue that the R&D tax credit has helped drive as much innovation and investment from the private sector as is almost any single item. The idea of creating the equivalent of an R&D tax credit for businesses that invest in human capital, and if you gear that towards a greater value reward for investing in low and moderate income people, that's a radical notion that I've been pitching for the last 2 or 3 years, and maybe I'm the worst pitcher of it, or maybe it's not that good of an idea, but I think it would have as much to structurally change corporate behavior as anything. Because right now, what rational company that's only thinking about short-termism would ever invest in a human being? It just not rationally makes any sense. And matter of fact, the laws are stacked against you. So I think there's an idea there, and I would welcome anyone on this call to help. I would love your input.
I think we just lost him.
What happened? Did they time me out? Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, sorry.
There he
I
is.
loved what you had to say. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Putin. Amy, now you're muted.
Sorry. So John Paul Farmer, CTO of New York City. Last question.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Coach and IFE. Senator Warner, fantastic to have you here with us. Thanks again for championing the Talent Act several years back. But my question's about broadband, because I know that's on my mind. Other folks here, like Corey's Eric, are thinking about it too. And as you mentioned, we've seen the acceleration of the digitalization of life, and that means that broadband is absolutely essential. Here in New York City, we've done some things at the local level, like the Internet Master Plan, which is reimagining the local role, but obviously the federal government has powers that we do not. It's great to see the $7 billion included in the stimulus. That's good in the near term, but how are you thinking about the federal government's role in transforming the broadband marketplace, not just focusing on access, but also focusing on affordability, since that's such a barrier, and how do we go about closing the digital divide and ending digital poverty?
Well, John Paul, thank you for that question. And just first, our bipartisan plan had 10 billion, and how we got nicked on that last, and the sausage making, how we got nicked from 10 to 7. I'm still kind of pissed off. And frankly, I think we had a better delivery mechanism than what came in this bill. But I do think there is that understanding. And, I think one of the things we're thinking about next is a major infrastructure bill. And, whether the numbers to finish building out are somewhere between 85 and 100 billion. I'm not sure that's going to all come from the feds, but I think there is a real appetite that we realize that this is a essential, not a nice to have. So I think there will be an appetite there for further federal investment. I also think, and this is I'm trying to look through the list who I'm going to piss off when I say this, but I think there is a one-time opportunity here during COVID to look at those enterprises that have had their value go up the most during COVID, when we've been relegated to Zooms and activities and being online, and ask them for a one-time, I wouldn't call it an excess profits tax, I would call it a one-time civic contribution on broadband for the underserved and around affordability. So whether it's Facebook, Google, Amazon, to a lesser degree, Microsoft and Apple, maybe our friends at Zoom and elsewhere, where we say we want to see $10 to $20 billion put up for your contribution. Because if you just look as a small percentage of your additional value that's added to those companies over the last year, this is a small price, but they all are under assault at this point, from rightfully, in many cases, for their not great activities. And I think it's time for them to pony up. And I know the content guys and the network guys, the never the twain shall meet, but I think it's time for the content guys to come back. And then I think we need to really be much more aggressive with the network guys. And I say this as a former network guy with Nextel, and say the monopoly that you've got on delivery. I don't want to hear about your failure to build out a rural community. If you're not going to build it out, there needs to be competition. And whether that is a utility model from a local utility or other, and we do need to just, one of the things we shouldn't do is dictate that last mile. I'm not sure whether the last mile is going to be fiber, wireless, or satellite, but those promises of those three have been around for a long time. We need to be much clearer about when the delivery time for those that last mile can come. But so federal, let's get the content guys to do a one-time chip in as an act of public service. Let's come back to the ISPs with more competition, and let's really try to give a little more clarity on that last mile solution in a clearer way. I mean, SpaceX is delivering to a rural Appalachian county starting in January. But these ideas, to our friends, the ambassadors, whether it's about a technology agenda with the Biden administration that will be around this coalition of the willing, whether it's about helping think through this human capital investment or, stakeholder capitalism, whether it's about how we take this broadband, I would welcome any of your input. Bo, put your information in, and people like Anish obviously know how to get me, but this is a really, really first-rate group, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Senator Warner. Thank you for sharing your insights and spending this time with us today. On behalf of Coach Kemper and everyone here at Team IFE, we wish you everyone health, safety, and hope in the new year. And to conclude, there is a short video clip produced by Team IFE celebrating the civic tech community that IFE has been proud to be part of these past 7 years. See you next year.